myself, Marlene Kolbert, and Bonnie Weinbach, who have been working to help the temple in our community become more sustainable. Several years ago, we implemented a composting and recycling program, and with the help of our outstanding temple staff, students, and congregants, we now have recycling and compost collection points throughout our buildings. Our compostable waste is now brought to composting facilities and is kept out of landfills, greatly reducing our waste amounts. Jane has also done a great deal to address energy use of the temple, including insulated windows, more efficient lighting, and upgrading our HVAC systems, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And the group is looking at solar and other options for the future. A couple of years ago, several houses of worship in Larchmont joined together to form HOW for Houses of Worship Green, How Green. And we have many of those members on the call today. We welcome you all. This group has further expanded recycling and composting efforts to other congregations and has hosted several seminars on green topics. Today's event was to have been a physical seminar last spring that we were planning, but we're delighted to present it today via Zoom. We have a terrific panel of speakers today who bring diverse backgrounds and will offer different perspectives on sustainability, including spiritual, scientific, culinary, and community action. But an overarching message is that world population growth and human activities are severely challenging our global sustainability, and we all need to take responsibility and take action to address this. There's a concept in Judaism of tikkun olam, which means that each individual can act constructively, taking even small steps to repair and improve the world. Whether this means starting your own home compost pile, collecting your compost and bringing it to a collection center, using parts of produce and meats you might have otherwise thrown out, changing to LED light bulbs, or insulating your home, there are many small steps we can all take that can help. Before we begin, a reminder, as Jane mentioned, please enter any questions you have during the program into the chat session, which Bonnie Weinbach will monitor, and we'll get to Q&A after the speaker presentations. I'll mention, though, that Elizabeth Kolbert, unfortunately, I will not be able to stay around for the Q&A, but we'll have our other speakers still around. But I'm pleased now to introduce Rabbi Leora Frankel. Rabbi Frankel strives to empower families to blaze their own spiritual trails while remaining rooted in Judaism's 4,000-year-old tradition. She previously served at Community Synagogue of Rye for 9 years, where she created many innovative programs. We're very happy that she's now a member of our Larchmont Temple clergy. And it's my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Frankel.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to see everyone on this cold day. And for those of you who I haven't met yet, again, Leora Frankel, I'm the Associate Rabbi at Larchmont Temple. And I just want to say on behalf of our professional staff, our wonderful lay leadership who organized this, thank you for joining us today. As with our fellow faith communities, environmentalism is deeply, deeply rooted in Judaism and our sacred scriptures. And so I just want to spend a few minutes contextualizing, framing a little bit before we get into really the main event of today. As many of you probably know, the whole Jewish festival calendar, which is a slightly adjusted lunar calendar, is really rooted in the agricultural cycle and the seasons in the land of Israel in particular. And we see in our texts from 3,000 years ago, really the underpinnings of our contemporary commitments towards stewardship and sustainability. It all starts, of course, with creation. In chapter 2 of Genesis, we read the story of Adam and Eve being placed in the Garden of Eden to till and tend it, or from another translation, to work and protect it. What's interesting is our Jewish sources, the Midrash, our rabbinic commentary, takes this command of God's to till and tend and actually expands it, imagining a slightly more elaborate conversation that God has with these first humans. In the Midrash, in the legend, we're told that God walks Adam and Eve all around the Garden of Eden, pointing out all of its beauties. Look at my creations, God says. See how beautiful they are and perfect? I created all of this for you, but make sure you don't destroy it, because if you do, there will be no one after you to fix it. Of course, the opening chapters of the Torah also seem to acknowledge the inherent challenge we face as humans, inhabiting the earth without destroying it. because there's in fact a different creation narrative, which comes in chapter 1 of Genesis. This is a whole other lecture, the two creation stories and how they compare. But the first one, the one that talks about the 6 days of creation and the seventh God resting, in that version, God's command is a little bit different to humanity. In this one, we're told that not only should we be fruitful and multiply, that we should replenish the earth, but also subdue it, to exercise dominion over all that swims and flies and creeps upon the earth. Slightly different tenor than till and tend. And so later in the Torah, when the newly freed Israelites are given this litany of laws to help them set up their new society in the Promised Land, environmental justice is, in fact, one thematic thread, acknowledging that tension between the privilege and responsibility we have vis-a-vis the planet. Probably the most famous of the Torah laws that connects to our theme today is in Leviticus, the notion of a sabbatical year. That 6 years were to work the fields, and in the 7th, let it rest. That the land itself deserves and needs a Sabbath. Of course, long before we had detailed scientific evidence of this benefits, our ancestors understood the essential wisdom of soil conservation. And of course, laws like the sabbatical year weren't just for the benefit of the earth, but they also had a spiritual lesson for us. To teach us, I believe, that we can always make do with less. That we can always, as the miracle of Hanukkah teaches, take a small amount of resources and make it last even longer. And of course, that ultimately the earth doesn't belong to us, that it's on loan from God. Just this past week in our Jewish community, we celebrated a slightly lesser known holiday called Tu B'Shvat in Hebrew, the birthday of the trees or the Jewish Arbor Day. In Israel, it's a time when all of the school children go out and plant new trees. It feels a little strange to be celebrating Tu B'Shvat, especially with an impending snowstorm coming tonight. But over in the land of Israel, the very first almond trees are just starting to blossom, the very first hints of spring. And it's a time where traditionally as Jews, we celebrate, appreciate, learn about, rededicate ourselves to nature. So I just want to close with a quick little story from the Talmud that's very much associated with this holiday of Tu B'Shvat, and I think captures the spirit of what we're doing. It's a story about a man named Honi. He's a character in the Talmud a couple thousand years ago, and in this story, one day Honi goes for a walk. He's walking down through the village on a dirt road, and he notices an old man hunched over with a little shovel digging a hole and planting a sapling. Well, Honi has a little bit of chutzpah, and he asks the man, "Excuse me, sir, you're so old. Why are you planting this tree? Really, will you live long enough to enjoy its fruits?" And the man starts laughing. "Oh no, it'll be 70 years before this carob tree bears fruits. But just as my ancestors planted for me, so too am I obligated to plant for the next generation." So this is fundamentally, I think, what each of us believe, that, right, the earth isn't a gift from our parents, but it's something we've borrowed from our children. And following the 3,000-year-old tradition of sustainability, of stewardship, we're really thrilled today to have all these different voices and perspectives from our temple community who can help us live out these Jewish values, these interfaith universal values. And it's Bashir, it's really perfect that while this is not the day we intended this program to be on, that it comes right on the heels of Tu B'Shvat. We are indeed celebrating and rededicating ourselves to nature today. So thanks so much again for being with us.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi Frankel. There's some terrific lessons and messages in that. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Kolbert. We're very fortunate to have her on with us today. Betsy and I were neighbors as kids growing up in Larchmont, and she's a fellow Mamaroneck High School graduate. Elizabeth has had an illustrious career. She's a staff writer for New Yorker magazine, where she writes about environmental issues. And she's also the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Sixth Extinction, in which she looks at the current harm to the world from human activity in the context of previous mass extinctions on Earth. Her new book, due out next week, so watch for it, is entitled Under a White Sky. Congratulations on your new book, Betsy, and I'll now turn the meeting over to you.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. So as Paul mentioned, this was originally supposed to be a celebration and reflection on Earth Day after 50 years, Earth Day 1970, Earth Day 2020. We're several months late for obvious reasons, but I'm gonna sort of pick up where with that theme. And I was actually living in Larchmont in 1970. I don't remember if there were any Earth Day events in Larchmont. Maybe some people here today do. But as you all know, it was really a big deal. In New York City, there was a huge turnout of people. They dragged dead fish through the streets, for example. In Boston, people stayed to die in at Logan Airport. In Philadelphia, they signed an oversized all species declaration of interdependence, and all told 20 million people turned out, and at the time that was 1 out of every 10 Americans. So it was a huge showing. And what followed from that, once again, as you all know, it was this incredible sort of fluorescence of environmental action and legislation. So later that year in 1970, the end of 1970, Richard Nixon signed the Environmental Protection Agency into being. Almost all of our major environmental laws passed in the next few years: the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, and the Endangered Species Act. Those were all passed in the early 70s. And if we had actually, gotten together in April of 2020, it would have been a pretty depressing anniversary. Many of you have probably been following on the New York Times. They were tracking as the Trump administration rolled back one environmental regulation after another, and the final tally was more than 100 environmental rollbacks over 4 years. And they were, across the board, pretty terrible. Some of them were pretty technical, but even in being pretty technical, all of them were fairly consequential. And I'm just gonna give you a tiny, sampling of what was rolled back over the last 4 years. So they changed the way that cost-benefit analyses are conducted under the Clean Air Act, so making it harder to issue new public health protections. They finalized, I'm sure everyone read about this, they finalized a plan to allow oil and gas development in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They lifted a Clinton-era ban on logging and road construction in the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. They approved the Keystone XL pipeline. They weakened the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which is really one of our most significant environmental laws, which allows public input on major projects. So the new rules shorten the time frame for completing environmental reviews. They limit the type of projects subject to review, and they no longer require federal agencies to account for projects' cumulative effects on the environment. They rolled back the regulations, policies aimed at protecting migratory birds. Anyway, as I said, we could go on and on, but that's just a sampling. So so we didn't celebrate, last year. COVID intervened, an election intervened, and thank God, obviously now we have a new administration. So the 51st anniversary of Earth Day will not be quite so dire. So I thought I would talk just a little bit about what we can expect over the next 2 to 4 years, now that we do have a new Congress and a new administration. And the good news is that the Biden administration has come out of the box very strongly in this last couple of weeks. The president signed 2 sets of environmental executive orders. His very first day in office, he recommitted to the Paris Climate Accord, canceled the Keystone XL pipeline permit. He stopped, put a pause on leases for drilling for fossil fuels on federal lands. Then he signed last Wednesday a very major executive order that had a gazillion different parts to it. It created a new Office of Climate Policy, Domestic Climate Policy. It created an Interagency Council on Environmental Justice. It directed all federal agencies to use their purchasing power to foster the development of electric cars and clean energy. And so these are really positive developments, and I really want to stress that. And I also think that Biden has a very strong climate team in place, really smart people who have been in the trenches for a long time and know what they're doing, including Gina McCarthy, who used to be at EPA, John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State, as you know. And I think that these are people who really do want to get something done. So that's the good news. And now the not so good news, which you knew was coming. So first of all, simply unraveling what Trump is going to do, all the damage that the Trump administration did is going to take quite a long time and a lot of labor. Just rewriting those regulations is extremely laborious and time consuming. You can't just say, you can't just wave a wand and put new regs in place. You have to, undo all of that. A lot of things are in litigation now. The new administration will not defend them, presumably, but they will have to rewrite all of those regulations, promulgate them, put them out there for comment, et cetera. So that's just, time consuming and labor intensive. But also the administration gutted a lot of agencies. They really gutted the EPA. They gutted parts of the Interior Department. So a lot of good people just left. So the question of, just staffing becomes a big issue. Now, third, there's, the problem of Congress. So we really need some good legislation. This is particularly true of climate change, but it's also true for other environmental problems. We're still operating off of those laws that were passed in the wake of the first Earth Day. We have not had a major piece of environmental legislation passed in the US since 1990 under George H.W. Bush, when the last major amendments to the Clean Water Act were passed. So that's 30 years where we have not had a piece of major environmental legislation. And we have a lot of new problems that we have to try to solve using old laws. And that's getting increasingly complicated. And it seems, unlikely, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it seems unlikely that with a 50-50 split in the Senate, the Democrats are going to get anything significant passed. But it's not impossible. I don't want to say it's impossible. It gives a few senators, unfortunately, like Joe Manchin, who's now head of the Environmental and Energy and Natural Resources Committee, a tremendous amount of power. And as you all know, Joe Manchin comes from West Virginia, a coal state. So that's very problematic, though once again, not impossible. But basically what that means in the absence of legislation is that the administration is going to have to try to do whatever it wants to do via regulation. And then this brings us to the Supreme Court, because every new reg that they promulgate will get litigated. And there's a lot of concern about how they're going to craft these new regs to try to withstand scrutiny by a 6-3 Supreme Court. So it's a pretty complicated and to be honest, perilous situation. So that's the sort of situation we're in. I don't think anything I've said, to be honest, is terribly controversial. This is sort of the conventional wisdom, I guess, I would say, in environmental circles. But I thought I would just take a couple minutes to talk about what I think people, in Larchmont in particular, although I see people here I know who are not from Larchmont. A shout out to my aunt in New Jersey and Judy and Dave in Arizona. But this is true wherever you are. Doesn't matter if you're in Larchmont or not. The first is, the obvious, to be in touch with your representatives and tell them that this is an issue that you really want to see at the top of the agenda. If you are in Larchmont, obviously Chuck Schumer will have a lot to say about what does reach the Senate floor. And he needs to hear from people that this is an issue they really care about. You know, ditto for the governor, ditto for Andrew. And third, and perhaps, you know, most important on a community level, since you all are working on a community level, is to think about, and here I'm really talking about climate change, not other environmental problems, though they are multifarious. I think that communities really need to be looking at what, if we're going to reach, you know, net zero, that is supposedly the administration's goal eventually. How do we get from A to B? How will the community be transformed, and how can we start that process now? So, you know, one thing to be thinking about, electric cars. I do think the time is coming. We're going to have electric cars, and we're going to transition to electric cars. What can Larchmont be doing to speed that transition? You know, where are the charging stations? How do you make that? How do you encourage people to buy into that? Public transportation, huge. Now in the, you know, pandemic, it's been, you know, devastated. The MTA has been devastated, et cetera. But public transportation has to be part of the solution to climate change. There's just no way around that. Another thing on a local level are building codes. What are the building codes on the local level? Are they as stringent as they can possibly be with regard to, you know, energy consumption? Some communities in California are now cutting off, you know, new gas hookups in an effort to sort of speed this transition to electrifying everything and hopefully having a much cleaner grid in the future. If you're going to, you know, get to net zero, you're going to have to do away with, you know, oil heat and even gas hookups. Then another question I think to ask is about siting. I mean, if we're going to be moving to a renewable grid, we're going to be siting a lot of energy projects. What are the rules? And I don't know the answer to this. I'm sure you all do. What are the answers about the rules about putting up solar panels in Larchmont? Can that be, you know, facilitated? Because here again, I do want to say that every community is going to have to do its part. It is not going to be enough to say, well, that's something that's going to have to happen somewhere else. It's going to have to happen everywhere in a distributed grid. Everyone's going to have to take a share of that new energy infrastructure. And, you know, that includes very lovely, beautiful communities like Larchmont. You're going to have to figure out where those projects should be sited. And the last thing I'll say before turning over the mic or whatever this is, you know, Larchmont is a community that's on the front lines of climate change with sea level rise. You are at sea level. So it's something that will affect, you know, the community, and it's something that the community should be very, I think, progressive in thinking about, trying to adaptation. You're going to have to, you know, think about all that below sea level infrastructure. And also be very forward thinking in what you can do to be part of the solution here. So that's it for me today. And now I'm going to hand it back to Paul. Thank you.
Great. Well, hey, thank you, Betsy. And it's clearly a huge agenda that needs to be addressed or revisited. And a lot of stuff from the last 4 years, you know, is currently being undone, which you know, hopefully will, you know, get us back into the right directions in a lot of cases. I'm really pleased now to introduce Adam Kaye. Adam is a Larchmont Temple congregant. I first met Adam over one of Larchmont Temple's small groups called Joe's, where we had group dinners, and I learned a lot from him over several terrific group dinners about food waste. He's the co-founder and chief culinary officer of the Spare Food Company. Spare Food seeks to design waste out of the food system using culinary innovation and design thinking. Adam was most recently the culinary director at Blue Hill Restaurant, where he spent almost 2 decades working alongside chef Dan Barber. Adam's a leading light at the forefront of culinary innovation and education in the burgeoning food waste movement. And Adam, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. And thanks to all of those who organized today. And I feel it's quite a challenge following Elizabeth in a panel like this, so I will try my best. But since I'm a professional chef and a Jewish professional chef, I think it's only fitting that I just start off talking about food. And I'm just going to talk about some dishes quickly, and then keep these in mind because I'm going to come back to them, and I'm just going to kind of rattle off a few dishes here, and hopefully this will all make sense. But if I say things like, well, look, let's start with gefilte fish, right? Or French toast, or panzanella, if anyone knows what panzanella is. Hopefully I'm not making anyone too hungry here. Bouillabaisse, cholent, seemingly random collection of foods and dishes that I'm rattling off here, but bear with me because, like I say, I will come back to them. I could have also mentioned coq au vin or pot au feu, some classic French dishes. All right, now I've got you thinking about food. I'm going to get to some of the depressing stuff, and then we'll come back to the tasty stuff again. I'm talking about food waste, and or actually what I like to refer to as wasted food, because there's a very important distinction between food waste and wasted food, just changing those two words around. All right. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, going to set the stage here, that for those of you who do not know, 30 to 40% of food that's produced and grown in this country is not consumed, which is a pretty staggering statistic. 30 to 40%. That's about 63 million tons annually around this country, which is the equivalent of around about 218 billion with a B, $218 billion worth of food. That's the financial, the dollar value on that, maybe a little bit higher actually these days. A recent study in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics actually said that shows that the average American household wastes about $1,800 worth of food annually. All right, so not an insignificant amount. Compound that with the statistic, which is probably a little outdated, especially during now mid-pandemic. 2017, the USDA study found that 1 in 8 American households are food insecure. I would venture to guess that has actually changed in the last year, that there are probably more people who are food insecure. That's roughly around 41 million people, which includes 13 million children. All right, so just think about that number. Think about 30 to 40% of our food that's produced and grown not being consumed. Sort of hard to reconcile all of that. Food filling up landfills is one of the largest drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. And the problem with food and wasted food ending up in landfills is that it produces methane gas, methane being 28 times more powerful than CO2, than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. All right, so if anyone might have any sort of doubts as to whether there's an impact of throwing away food, I think that possibly could put that to rest. You also have to think about when we're wasting food, it's not just the food that we're wasting, right? It's all the inputs, all the resources that go into producing that food. The water, the fuel, the fertilizer, transportation, right? So it's not just the food alone. So when you start kind of seeing that ripple effect of what wasting food is all about, the statistics even get a little bit more frightening. So that 30 to 40% of food that's wasted that I mentioned at the outset, that accounts for about 19% of all American cropland. All right, so that's about 1/5 of American cropland is basically being wasted, or 21% of the water used in agriculture. All right, so again, it's not just that, I don't know, half-eaten bunch of grapes that you throw away, or your kid's school lunch that doesn't get eaten, or food in a restaurant that doesn't get consumed. Again, we have to think about what that food actually represents in terms of what it took to produce that food. A statistic that I find absolutely, I know I'm bombarding you with a lot of statistics, but it's really important to kind of set this up a little bit here, that I find absolutely fascinating. If food waste were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases after China and the US. All right, so that kind of like, that really puts things into perspective. Okay, but on the bright side, and there is a bright side to this, and this is where especially myself as being a chef gets very excited. So there was a fantastic study that came out. There's an organization that was founded in 2014 called Project Drawdown. I don't know if anyone is familiar with it. If you aren't, you should check it out. They published a book called Drawdown, a study. Project Drawdown is a group of environmental scientists and researchers from around the world who basically ranked the top 100 ways, the most effective ways that we can achieve drawdown of carbon in the atmosphere. So not just stopping and halting greenhouse gases, but actually reversing the impact of global warming and climate change. And they ranked the top 100 approaches. The original edition of Drawdown, which came out in 2017, reducing food waste was ranked number 3 in this list of top 100 approaches. As of last year, when they released the new edition, lo and behold, reducing food waste is the number one strategy approach to reducing food waste, to reducing to actually reversing the impact of climate change. So ahead of solar panels, ahead of battery electric vehicles, you name it. Improved refrigeration methods, reducing food waste, the number one approach to actually not just halting global warming, but actually drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. What's also interesting, just generally speaking, is that 8 out of the top 20 solutions are actually food related. So if for 1 minute anyone thinks that our food choices day in and day out in terms of what we're choosing to eat and the food we purchase, what we do with our food, what we do with leftover food, doesn't have any kind of an impact on the world in which we live in, I hate to say it to you, but you are horribly misguided. And I would hope to think that that everyone here realizes this, that our food choices are incredibly significant. Okay, so I've just kind of set the stage. There's a lot of facts and figures and numbers. What's interesting is that in my story, I didn't come to this issue around wasted food from any kind of science or policy or environmental activism point of view. I actually just came to it by being a chef. As Paul said at the outset, I've cooked for almost 20 years at Blue Hill Restaurant, Blue Hill at Stone Barns, since around 2004, Blue Hill, New York before that, working alongside Chef Dan Barber, a restaurant on a farm, really kind of the hotbed of sustainable and regenerative farming and agriculture and eating of the last 20 years, 25 years. And it was through my role as a chef and culinary director at Blue Hill that I really became interested in this issue. In 2015, Chef Barber and I created a pop-up restaurant concept. It was a very short-lived 2.5-week restaurant concept called Wasted. And the idea of Wasted was to create a menu out of product that we ordinarily would never see in our kitchen. And this wasn't just scraps, et cetera, from our own kitchen, but it was really a deep dive into our entire supply chain to unearth ingredients, and I use the word ingredients, that were currently, or at that time, were being seen as waste. So we reached out to all the farmers we were dealing with, the processors, the distributors, to basically unearth this treasure trove of product that we created a menu around. And we went to, I don't know, Acme Smoked Fish in Brooklyn and got smoked salmon skin from them that they were throwing away when they were slicing their lox. Or we went to a cold pressed juice facility, all those very expensive, overpriced cold pressed juices, your carrot, ginger, kale juice, etc. and we got all the pulp that you generate from that, all that incredible fiber and flavor, and we created a veggie burger out of that pulp. And we went to a pasta manufacturer and got all the scraps of pasta and created a pasta dish. And this took off in ways that we never really anticipated. And in fact, in 2017, we went to London and we did a 7-week version of this pop-up in London. A blown out menu, even more in depth, very different menu. Obviously, we're in the UK, very different supply chain. We weren't local players on the scene. And again, found this treasure trove of ingredients to create a menu around. And it was through that process of those 2 pop-up restaurants and that R&D of the menu and the ingredient search, and then the development of the dishes, that this awareness building really started for me around the magnitude of this issue. What also became really apparent very quickly, and that's why I started with listing off that seemingly random selection of dishes, was that what we were doing in the kitchen at the restaurant was actually what people have always done when it's come to eating and cooking, and that is using everything. This is not a new idea. Especially in the culinary world, this is not a new idea. The idea of wasting food is a very modern concept. It's really kind of post-World War II and beyond. It's the advent of cheap food from fertilizers, the fertilizer industry, which is really what happened to the munitions industry. All right, what's one of the major components of gunpowder is nitrogen. What's one of the major components of chemical fertilizer? Nitrogen. So that entire industry post-World War II, all the R&D that went into that industry was redirected to agriculture. So food became a lot cheaper. You have the proliferation and the advent of much cheaper refrigeration. Suddenly food just became a slightly less valuable commodity for many people. Very different to the history of humankind, right? This idea of wasting food, as I say, is just historically unconscionable. And if you look at any of the great culinary traditions around the world, and I say you could throw a dart at a map of the world and you will land on some incredible culinary tradition, you will find dishes that are created out of necessity, all right? Or dishes created out of less sort of high-end, more humble ingredients, right? So let's just take gefilte fish, right? You're not using a pristine salmon fillet to make gefilte fish. No, you use, generally, historically, it was probably a cheaper white fish. You used everything. You took the bones, you made a stock. That's what you cooked your gefilte fish in. Same goes true around the world. Take something like French toast, all right? The French word for French toast is pain perdu, okay? I don't speak much French, but pain perdu means lost bread. Well, why is it lost? It's because it got stale, right? And you lost the bread. Well, instead of throwing it out, because throwing out the bread wasn't actually an option, well, the French and all their culinary brilliance realized, well, if you dip it in some egg and you fry it up, it's like better than the original piece of bread, right? So this is the kind of thinking that is really like the underpinning of cuisines around the world. And so what we were doing at the restaurant in these pop-up concepts was really, in some ways, very reactionary. This idea of looking at the entire system of food production and saying, well, we can't really be cherry picking, deciding what's most valuable. We need to find value in everything because otherwise we're sunk, quite frankly. So that really was my journey. That led to my current company, the Spare Food Company, which is as Paul said earlier, we're a culinary innovation company. We actually develop food products by identifying these ingredient streams at scale and then capturing these ingredient streams and developing new products and menu items, for example, around that. Let's bring this now back into our personal lives. What can we all do about this? Because while the scope of the problem is truly catastrophic and it's sort of hard to wrap your mind around, as you know, those statistics and those numbers that I was talking about at the outset, the incredible thing is that we all have to eat. We all shop for food. And we actually have the agency to make some change here. And what I find incredibly promising about this issue in particular is that, I mean, just listening to Elizabeth and the scope of the issue sort of globally of all sorts of environmental issues, it's really kind of hard to sort of think like, well, where can I make an impact? Where do you start? Again, as I said, we all have to eat. It's a great place to start, and in that sense, I actually find this quite a hopeful place to be in, because we can all make little changes in our lives that will actually have huge impact. A lot of the food waste is happening upstream on farms, in processors, retail-facing businesses, restaurants, food service, cafes, but a lot of it's happening in our own homes. And I think part of what we're doing here is to really try and create some sort of an awareness around this and how we can actually take control of this issue. I think, for example, what LT has been doing in the last couple of years has been really impressive and sort of taking the lead in terms of composting, food waste, etc. What I will say, though, is, and I don't want to burst anyone's bubble here, is that composting, while is absolutely essential, and I have a compost bin in my kitchen and no food waste, and my kids know very well that in fact they kind of police my wife and I more than anything else. Composting should always be a last resort. Well, I should say going into the trash should always be a last resort, but I'm actually going to take that one off the table because that isn't even a resort, right? Composting should always be a last resort. We should always be figuring out what can we do to prevent food from actually getting to the point where it needs to get composted in the first place. The Environmental Protection Agency put out what they called a food recovery hierarchy about 6 or 7 years ago. And it's an inverted pyramid where the point of the triangle, which is now the bottom, is landfill. And then each rung above it, as the triangle gets wider, that funnel gets wider, is a sort of a preferable approach to reducing food waste in this hierarchy of food waste reduction. The top layer, so that widest point of the triangle, is actually prevention. How do you actually stop food waste from happening? Then you go to food recovery and redistribution to people who need food, to the food insecure. Then you go down another rung and you can go to feeding animals, let's say. That is an option. There are animal feed programs that can take food scrap and feed them to animal. Power generation, methane generation, another great solution. But again, all of these are actually far low down. Compost is actually one level above landfill. So by that point, you've actually lost a lot of the value of the food, and you've lost other opportunities to intercept that waste beforehand. So again, not to downplay anyone's composting efforts. Again, incredibly essential that we're keeping it out of landfill. What can we do at home? Well, there's a few things. Number one is I think we should all be cooking more. And as a chef, I feel like I can say that, but I feel like I should say that. But we cook more. We tend to become more adventurous. We become better cooks. We tend to use more in the kitchen. Shop more intentionally and shop more, in a more organized way. Shop with a list. I think I just know for myself, I go to the supermarket for 3 items and I come out with 12 items, right? Is that always necessary? I also try, I'm just talking little tips and tricks here. I also try and whenever possible, not purchase items that are pre-packaged. For example, I just think, fruit and vegetables being a great example. You need a couple of lemons, you buy a bag of 12 lemons because you think it's probably going to be a better price per pound or per lemon. But ultimately you end up wasting those lemons because you only needed 2 and you actually end up paying on the back end because you didn't, you ended up not using them. Another really important thing, use your freezer. I mean, any kind of leftover in my kitchen ends up in the freezer. Little bits of rice or things like that, I'll collect. And then we have fried rice, 2 weeks later because we've collected enough little, deli containers of rice. These are just little tricks, and also to really watch expiration dates is very important. One last thing that I would say, and that's just talking about our own community. It's been really impressive to see what's been going on in the community. Just food waste collection, the composting. I compost on, I live in Mamaroneck, I compost on around the corner from me here in Mamaroneck. There's, every day I go there, there's usually 1 or 2 other cars. The compost bins are full. It's incredible to see. There's also incredible things happening in the school district as well. I've been involved in teaching the teachers. So I've been doing a bunch of sessions with faculty in each of the school, actually, to how this can actually get integrated into the curriculum. It's a great thing to integrate into curriculum, whether you're talking about math or science or creative writing or art. There's a lot of really engaging ways that we can get kids involved in this issue as well. So I'm truly thankful, to be a part of a community like Larchmont Temple that's taking this issue seriously, but the larger community as well, that there's really is, in the last 2 years especially, I would say, huge steps forward. So with that in mind, and with good eating and eating well and being conscious of what we're doing, I truly am hopeful about this issue. So thank you all for your time. I really appreciate being a part of this discussion.
Great, Adam. Thank you. That was terrific. You gave us, I think, a great view into both the scope and magnitude of some of the issues of wasted food, but also gave us some insight into where some of the great possible solutions are coming from, whether culinary arts, logistics, even chemistry of how you deal with recipes, and probably even extends to things like our own legislative agenda. Why are we subsidizing crops that are not ending up on people's tables? That was great. If I can mention too, some of the previous How events around town have brought some films to their agendas too. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a film out there called Wasted that addresses the topics that Adam's been talking to too, and it's a great documentary to take a look at. We're happy now, though, to take it even closer to home to some local efforts that have been taking place, and we're terrifically pleased to have Karen Khor with us to talk about some of the programs that she's developed within the community. Karen's a volunteer for the Town of Mamaroneck Sustainability Collaborative. She's spearheaded Larchmont Mamaroneck's food scrap recycling program, spent many Saturdays at the local farmers market, helping a lot of us take advantage of the composting programs in place locally. She spearheaded that food scrap recycling program and also helped start Mamaroneck School District's food rescue efforts, where surplus food is donated to nearby soup kitchens in partnership with our community's Love Your Food initiative. So Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everybody. So I'm Karen Khor. I'm a volunteer with the Town of Mamaroneck Sustainability Collaborative. I'm also a parishioner at St. Augustine's Church and have been involved in the How Green collaboration with the Sustainable Sunday series among houses of worship in Larchmont. So thank you. Together with other volunteers, I've helped the town to raise awareness and increase participation in food scrap recycling in the town of Mamaroneck and village of Larchmont since over 3 years ago. And I think I just want to take off from where Adam left off. I think you all will be happy to know that our tri-municipal communities of town of Mamaroneck and villages of Larchmont and Mamaroneck have been very much actively engaged, as Adam mentioned, in reducing wasted food, sharing our access with those in need, and also composting the rest. And this is in a community initiative called Love Your Food, thanks in part to a New York State grant that we received last year, 2019, sorry. Our aim of Love Your Food is to inspire residents, including students, to reduce the amount of food we waste, share the excess with those in need, and compost the rest. And I would like to invite all of you to please check out our website, loveyourfoodny.org, as you can see in my background, to find out how you can start to find out practical tips that Adam mentioned on how you can reduce wasted food at home. Start off with, right at the top of the pyramid, how you can reduce your wasted food at home every day. and also how you can start. In this website, you'll also find out how you can start recycling food scraps if you haven't already. And you'll also learn what our communities are doing to tackle wasted food and all the important things that we're doing. So we welcome your ideas and your involvement in all these vital climate-friendly actions, which we can all be part of on an everyday basis. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Karen. And I think that kind of brings us to the point where we've gone from looking at some of the massive global issues and sustainability that Elizabeth and Adam both brought up, and Karen now brings us right to the local areas where we are a lot of steps and actions that we all can take. So hopefully we've both given all of you an idea of the magnitude of issues out there, but giving you some ideas too of things that you can do yourselves. We're going to open it up now for Q&A, and Bonnie Weinbach, hopefully you've been monitoring the chat entries, and if you picked out some questions that we can pose to our speakers, we'll turn it over to you now, Bonnie.
Hey everyone, great presentations. I don't see specific questions, so feel free to type them into the chat if you have any. I have one for Adam, if that's okay. I had two questions for Adam. One of them was, do you have plans to open another pop-up shop? And what was the favorite dish that you sold? And then the other question I had was, where can we purchase your products? Because I didn't even know you were doing that. That's really great.
Two good questions. Okay, let's deal with the first one. So the pop-ups were I don't think those are going to happen. Those were Blue Hill, 2 Blue Hill restaurant events. I don't believe they're coming back, which is why I left Blue Hill in my full-time capacity to start the Spare Food Company, so I could really focus on this. In terms of my favorite dishes, I would say the most iconic dish, and it was the only dish that we had on the menu in New York, and then we took to London as well, was the one I referenced earlier, this veggie burger, this juice pulp veggie burger, which was, it was so emblematic of what we were trying to do. And people, there's such a craze about cold pressed juices, and they're delicious. I enjoy them, but they're just an unbelievably that industry is so wasteful to juice all these incredible vegetables, these carrots, your kale, your beets, whatever it is, and you're getting all this stuff out of there, but you're leaving behind, and just an immense. Anyone juices at home on a regular basis. This is not a critique of you, but you're probably aware of how much pulp you get out of that, right? Well, do that on an industrial scale. And we're talking like tractor trailer loads of the stuff. So and the pulp it's full of fiber, it's got flavor, it's got lovely color. So we took it back to the kitchen. We found a processor in Long Island City that was making a lot of this stuff. I mean, they were doing thousands of gallons a week of this stuff, and as you can imagine, how much pulp that they were generating. And we tried all sorts of different things, and ultimately we came up with this burger that really primarily featured carrot pulp, beet pulp, and celery pulp, and then a bunch of other ingredients. And it was, I'll just say, it was an unbelievably delicious veggie burger. We put cheese on it, and then the bun itself was made by Balthazar Bakery. And they actually used a very old French technique of taking stale bread and grinding it up into a flour and taking that almost into a very fine breadcrumbs and adding that back to the dough. So the buns themselves were made from upcycled food. In terms of my product, the first product is going to be released pretty soon. I can tell you it's going to happen in about early spring. Will be our first Spare Food product, and it's a probiotic sparkling tonic that's made from the co-product of the Greek yogurt industry, from whey, from acid whey. So the Greek yogurt industry is really centered in this country here in New York State, and the byproduct of making strained yogurt, Greek style yogurt, is this incredibly nutritious liquid that people have been drinking for millennia that gets thrown away by the, oceans full amounts in New York State alone. And there are a lot of environmental issues around disposing it. So we have actually created a beverage which will be hitting the market pretty soon, actually. So keep an eye out for it.
Great. Can't wait. Oh, the other question was, I guess, where can we purchase your items? So we will keep our eyes.
Yeah. You can go to sparefood.com and you'll be seeing a lot about that coming up soon.
Great. Karen, there was a question for you if from a member. Could you provide an update on where we are in a community about having food waste picked up instead of dropping it off?
Yeah, so it's, currently our food scrap recycling program is a voluntary drop-off program. There was a public hearing recently to change the local solid waste law. This is for Town of Mamaroneck and Village of Larchmont to basically make curbside collection the default, because as many of you may know, we had back door, side door pickup. Now we are making curbside, the town is making curbside collections the default. And this is an important step forward in terms of enabling also other sustainability improvements to the waste management system to go forward, and hoping that the next step will include also curbside collection of food scraps. And it's, please do let our elected officials and administrators know this is important to you. They do want to hear that. We're hoping we will be working on this.
All right,
next.
Thanks for the update. We can keep the list from this recording and add them to any future updates on that. We had a question, this might be for Jane or Rabbi Frankel, about would it be possible to have solar panels on any of the roofs at the houses of worship? Are we looking into that? Do you know if any of the churches or other temples are? If you could speak to that.
Actually, I would turn this question over to Paul, but Larchmont Temple Sustainability Committee has been discussing this for several years. We have not yet concluded that we have the, I guess, the right roof for solar, but maybe Paul, you can add a few more words on that.
Sure. As a group, we just had a meeting within the last, I think, 6 weeks or so with an area resident who's actually in the business. We've been looking at feasibility. We've been looking at options. The technology keeps changing too. At some point, hopefully, we'll find a solution that makes sense, certainly for Larchmont Temple, and certainly encourage other organizations and individuals as well and residents to look into it too. Certainly, in fact, the person we talked to actually has a business built around solar roofing with roofing panels that are more attractive than some of the clunkier stuff you've seen in the past. So we got our eyes open on it. Just a matter of waiting until the right kind of combination of product solutions and financial results from being able to put it in, make it possible.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Jane. All right, we have a question for Adam. What techniques do you use to keep fruit and veggies last longer than typical? I have that issue too. I feel like I often end up throwing out some apples that, especially the strawberries, for some reason, seem to get moldy really quickly.
Yeah, fruit, berries especially. Well, you gotta just, one thing is just keep tabs on what you have in your fridge, firstly, and move older things to the front. Things like berries, especially. I mean, we always have berries in the house, and there's always some that I feel like they're about to start going. I basically just keep a little container in my freezer, and I'm constantly adding berries to it. And I make smoothies for my kids every morning almost. So those can go in the smoothie. Things like herbs are another thing. Herbs tend to wilt very quickly. I find just putting them in a sort of one of those reusable Ziploc baggy kinds of things that we keep around the house with a little bit of damp paper towel keeps them from drying out. There's some herbs actually like basil or cilantro that I'll actually keep in like a little mason jar of water in the fridge with a plastic bag over the top. And that keeps, cilantro will keep for a couple of weeks actually like that, because invariably you buy herbs and you're not going to use the entire, bunch in one shot. So that's definitely a tip for that. And then again, things like,
but like you use your drawer, you know how there's drawers for.
Yeah, I do. And I do use that. You can look at the humidity controls. I will just say, no, I don't want to evade this question. I'm I think giving you a few ideas here. The person who I think, in fact, I pulled out her book. I can just tell you, if anyone has an interest in this and this issue specifically around the home kitchen, I'm just going to hold up this book. Dana Gundes literally wrote she was with the NRDC, the Natural Resource Defense Council. She wrote the big report on food waste in America a few years ago. She now is the executive director of an organization called ReFed, which is sort of the primary clearinghouse around waste food issues. She wrote this book, The Waste-Free Kitchen Handbook, which actually has a lot of really useful tips for the home cook and actually how to use your refrigerator to your benefit.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Paul, I don't see any more questions.
I'm going to add one more if I could. This will be for Karen. And Karen, I'm wondering if you can share with us anything you're seeing from a legislative standpoint, either locally within our tri-municipality here, county level in Westchester, or state level going on that's going to address sustainability. I actually just recently heard from one of the Larchmont Environmental Committee members that there's pending legislation to make manufacturers selling within New York more responsible for the disposal of the materials from their products. Just wondering if there's anything that you're aware of that you can share with everyone here, and even things, more ideas of things we can do on an individual basis to help address all of this.
Oh, good question. I actually saw that there's going to be a public comment being invited for this legislation on in New York State requiring large generators of food waste, 2 tons a day or 2 tons a week. So there's the law that's going to be in New York State that's going to take place, I think, in 2022, requiring large generators of food waste to divert the food waste from the waste stream, either through food rescue or through proper organic recycling. And so they're inviting public comments on that. I can send you the link so that people can make comments on that in terms of legislation.
Right.
But so that's one way. And if people are not aware, the county, Westchester County, has really recently, in the past few months, come forward in trying to make food scrap recycling easily available to municipalities throughout the county by they've reduced the barriers, the financial barriers for municipalities to participate. They're really trying to make it financially easier for food scrap recycling to become a way of life. And once people are involved in that, then they start realizing how much is wasted, and then hopefully they work on what Adam has been saying, which is the more important thing, is preventing wasted food in the first place through just daily actions.
Great. Terrific. Thank you. Hey, I want to thank our speakers today. And I certainly want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today. We hope this has been both thought-provoking and educational. We're planning to post the recording of this webinar on the Larchmont Temple website for a limited time. So please tell your friends to take advantage and watch. And we're hoping that today's talks have given you some ideas to help you take some steps to support sustainability and the greening of the globe. Please stay tuned for further events coming from the Larchmont How Green Group in the future. Thanks very much to everyone.